So, welcome to Queer Activism from Life to Screen. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am coming to you today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded and the struggle for justice continues. So, welcome to MIFF Talks, presented in partnership with the University of Melbourne. And today we are talking about Hating Peter Tatchell, which is a MIFF Premiere Fund supported film. I am Hannah McCann and I'm a senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Melbourne, and I'm joined by Christopher Amos, the Hating Peter Tatchell director, and Peter Tatchell, the star of the documentary. So just some little introductions before we get chatting. Christopher Amos is an Australian director and producer born in Brisbane, Australia, and a resident of London for 2 decades from 1999 before his return home to Australia in 2019 to live in Surfers Paradise at the Gold Coast. A long-time journalist and LGBTQ activist, Christopher has created media content and entertainment for over 2 decades and has produced and directed independent short films, promos and documentaries. And Hating Peter Tatchell is his feature documentary debut. And Peter Tatchell, born in Melbourne, legendary activist based in London, has been campaigning for human rights, democracy, LGBTQ freedom, and global justice since 1967. Among his many involvements, he was a leading activist in the Gay Liberation Front between 1971 and 1974, and in the queer human rights group Outrage between 1990 and 2011. Through the Peter Tatchell Foundation, he currently campaigns for human rights in Britain and internationally. So thanks so much both for joining us today, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
So
I'm great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and I really enjoyed watching the documentary. I'm sure that the MIFF audience is going to get a lot out of it. I really felt very inspired by it myself. So I wanted to start by talking about the documentary and then later kind of maybe focusing a little bit more on LGBTQ activism. But I wanted to know, Chris, can you tell us, how did the documentary come about?
Yeah, so I've known Peter for over 20 years, and I graduated with a film and TV degree when I was younger. And I actually wanted to get back into making, I wanted to sort of move from print media into film and TV. So documentary seemed like a natural progression for me. And I produced a film called Dressed as a Girl, which was a passion project so that I could understand how the industry works. And knowing that I was going to produce my own feature film later down the track. And because I had access to Peter and I was not sympathetic, but really inspired by his story, I early on I knew that was the film that I wanted to make as my feature directorial debut. And so in 2015, I invited Peter to the premiere of my last film, Dressed as a Girl, and he was there for that. And actually, Peter actually has a little cameo in one of those, in a scene in that film. So it just felt like a natural progression, and that was 2015. And then, we started development and research, and 5 years later, here we are at MIFF.
And Peter, what was it like being asked to, have a documentary made about you?
Well, of course, one of the things that Chris was very surprised about was the way in which there never had been a documentary about my many decades of activism. He was quite surprised. He was also very shocked by the level of hatred and vitriol directed against me because of my human rights work. And that, I think, partly inspired the title of the film, Hating Peter Tatchell. I really, gave Christopher, complete editorial independence. It's his film, it's his interpretation. But obviously I collaborated by giving him access to videos that I had of my campaigns, my research files about those campaigns, some of my contacts. And of course, we went together to Moscow when I staged the protest at the 2018 World Cup. And Christopher shadowed me there and filmed my one-person protest near the Kremlin to help expose Russia's human rights abuses against LGBTI plus people, particularly in Chechnya, and of course, President Putin's collusion with that by his failure to stop it.
And Chris, what was that like, going to that, event and going into Russia at that time? When I watched it, I thought, oh, like, you're both at such high risk in that situation. I mean, how did you feel as the documentary maker?
Yeah, we'd been talking about going abroad from the UK to film some sort of action for a while. So there was I kind of anticipated it. And also I'd been shadowing Peter at some domestic direct action moments inside London as well. So I was able to sort of just be there and have him wired up with sound and stuff. So I had a little bit of a practice beforehand. But I think for me, when we got to Moscow, what I didn't anticipate was just how much security was around the Red Square where Peter was hoping to do the action. And they had military, they had secret police. It was just, there was almost as many police as there were, football fans, it felt like. And it just seemed almost like it was going to be impossible for us to do some sort of stunt that I'd be able to get on film and retain that film. So I had a little bit of anxiety about the whole situation, really, in terms of, keeping the footage safe, but also the action actually happening. But that's part of the excitement. And I think, you sort of get a bit of that in the film. Those 10 minutes in the film, that's just a culmination of several days in Moscow planning where and when the action was going to happen. It all had to be done covertly in secret. We weren't able to use emails or text messages and things like that to correspond with our sort of support team in London. So, yeah, it was really nerve-wracking and really exciting. It felt, it was necessary because also with this film, what's great is that you've got this observational documentary combined with the archival and biographical documentary. And that doesn't really happen in biographical films so much about human rights activists. A lot of the people that have documentaries made about them have retired and moved on, and it's all very much hindsight. So I wanted to make sure that because we had the access and because Peter is still on the front line, that we sort of captured that energy.
It's very powerful to watch and nerve-wracking to watch as well. And of course, there's so much archival footage as well throughout the film that is just as intense and high stakes. Yeah, of course, the footage that we see from Russia is, observational, as you say, Chris, but most of the film is archival. So, Peter, have you been mindfully archiving your activism over the years?
And not very methodically, but I did record TV interviews and TV coverage of some of the protests I've done. And that was very useful for Chris to reference and to get the original sources where that was possible. Where it wasn't possible, he had to use, material off old VHS tapes because sometimes the original source outlets, broadcast outlets, had not retained it. They're not archived it themselves. I think certainly I could have done a better job, but I wasn't looking to do activism with the foresight of having a documentary made about my life.
I think it's one of those things, isn't it, when you're in the activism, you're handing out leaflets, you're painting banners, you're not thinking about them as kind of historical items that you need to preserve. But of course, Chris, how was it trying to work with those random kind of assortment of archival materials and trying to get things off VHS? Was that really challenging?
Yeah, it was a project all on its own, to be honest. So Peter handed over almost 200 bits of VHS or CDs that had files on it. And so I didn't have budget to get it all digitized professionally at that point. So what I would do is I had a system that I had in place for myself, and I'd book it into an Airbnb for 4 or 5 days, and I'd literally just binge all these videos, and I would take notes and work out bits of conversation and clip the favourite actions or commentary. And I didn't really have any structure for the documentary when I was doing that. It was very much just getting context on Peter's whole life. And it was fascinating because there was so many amazing little bits that I would hear, like homophobic people on talk shows, religious people, politicians. And they were saying things that you just don't really get on talk shows nowadays, because obviously the people are so much more open to the LGBT community. But in the 80s and 90s, they weren't. They were very comfortable being homophobic on talk shows, and it was remarkable. And I think you get a sense of that when you watch the film, because you're kind of like, I really can't believe people used to talk like that back then. And it's that hindsight that I wanted to put in the film, so that you could look back on how things used to be. And so an audience watching it through today's lens will go, wow, we've made some progress here. There's hope. So, yeah, it was really important to sort of include those bits of archive. Yeah.
And Peter, what was it like watching that back for you, that such a long amount of time in activism condensed, and also what Chris is talking about, the vitriol that you've experienced over your career in activism?
Well, I suppose watching the documentary really brought home to me the longevity and breadth of my campaigning. It's not something I normally sit around and contemplate much. I just go on to the next campaign. But it was, quite moving, and brought home to me many, many memories and feelings about the moments of those various protests that I was involved in, many of which were, quite scary. In Moscow, the World Cup protest was the 5th protest I've done in Moscow. And on previous occasions, I've been badly beaten by neo-Nazis, been twice previously arrested by the police and detained. There's been many, many incidents where I've been very badly assaulted, including, of course, the famous attack by President Mugabe's bodyguards in Brussels in 2001, left me unconscious, albeit briefly. Now, reliving those moments, when I hear the crack on my skull of the fists of Mugabe's bodyguards, I even wince now at the memory of the shock, the pain, and the trauma it caused at the time. But of course, although I have a fear, and it's entirely rational and understandable, my passion for human rights overrides that fear. I think the duty of solidarity, the duty to support brave campaigners in Zimbabwe, Russia, and other countries, makes it important for me to be prepared to take some risks, to my potential freedom and risk to my physical well-being and safety. But of course, the risks I take are nothing by comparison to the risks that human rights defenders take in many other countries. Day in, day out, that they haven't got a British passport to escape the country. They haven't got an embassy on the phone to demand my release. They are there 24/7, 365 days a year, and they are at constant risk of violence from far-right extremists, and indeed from arrest and perhaps imprisonment by their own governments.
I think that's what's so inspiring about the film, is seeing your deep conviction and ability to keep going in the face of so many threatening things, and so much violence and the hatred that comes from the media, and even it sounds like the people that were around you a lot of the time and kind of close to you, questioning what you were doing. And to see you keep going in the face of all that, it's an amazing thing to capture.
At the time, I often didn't feel that. I was just driven by the passion, the determination to try and do something to stop an injustice. So I didn't really think too much about my own circumstances. I just thought, these people are being, an injustice is being perpetrated against them. I need to do something to help them, to shine a light on their struggle, to amplify their voices, to stand in solidarity with their struggle. And, looking back on it, sometimes I think, well, that was a very risky thing to do. And I can remember at the time, often during these protests, I'd have incredible nervous anxiety. I'd have a splitting headache, bordering on a migraine from the nervous tension, the fear of being caught out and failing, the fear of arrest, the fear of being beaten up. My heart would be pounding. I'd feel physically sick. My body temperature would plummet. It's not a nice experience doing some of these daring direct actions. But as I said, for me, the cause overrides the temporary discomfort and displeasure.
And I think, Chris, you really managed to capture this in the film and amazingly condense over 5 decades of Peter's activism. I mean, can you tell us about how you managed that in terms of actually deciding what would go in the film?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably my biggest anxiety about making this film, because, it's not even just 5 decades, because it's his childhood as well, which was very formative in how his life progressed. So I had to sort of go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, all the way through to today. So you're looking at I think it's 7 decades or something. And so, it's a 90-minute film, and I'm using different materials from observational video and archive and photos. And so there's different quality of media that's going to be used as well. So I sort of hit on the idea of this chat between Peter and Ian McKellen as a sort of master interview to hang everything on. So once I sort of had that sort of epiphany that's the best way to tell this story, I was able to sort of just keep coming back to that central master interview, which gave the overall film it connected it. And also the music I had professionally scored by Bob and Bun. And so the music and the color grading and this master interview basically allowed us to sort of time jump over those decades and make it not be too jarring. But in terms of the actual highlights from Peter's long career, what elements were we going to include to tell the story? There's a lot of protests and action that didn't feature in the film, and it was a bit like killing babies, so to speak, because they were really vital and important, especially some of the work around the anti-discrimination bill in South Africa after apartheid, which I would have loved to have included in the film. But then when you look at the actual storytelling and the story arc and the narrative and try and work out what visual archives I've got, it was a bit of a chess piece, a jigsaw puzzle really, where you're just trying to make everything fit, get as much in there, but not too much, let things breathe a little. So it was really difficult. Early on, though, Peter and I did map out a chronological chart from the 50s to today of all those key moments. And then throughout the research and development, I kept coming back to Peter with various treatments and workshopping that a bit with my producer as well, so that we could basically come up with something that we could hang this all on. And just, in a way, it's better to just have to cover the events that we did cover than trying to squeeze everything in. Hopefully, you never know, maybe Netflix or Amazon Prime or someone will just watch the film and think there's a bigger story to tell and commission a 10-part series. So that's fantastic. And then we can really go into great detail. Are you up for that, Peter?
Yeah,
It was a very big challenge for Chris. I've been involved in over 3,000 direct action protests over the last 54 years. I've been arrested 100 times. I've been subjected to over 300 violent assaults, including 50 attacks upon my apartment. It's been very, very tough, and there's such a huge wealth of potential subjects for this film. So Chris, I think, has done a magnificent job in being able to identify the few key ones that really make the story gel together.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds incredibly challenging, but I definitely like the idea of a series. Netflix, if you're listening. And particularly...
Chris is absolutely right. I was going to say that Chris is absolutely right. There was the story how I persuaded the African National Congress of South Africa to abandon its homophobia and to support LGBT plus rights. This was back in 1987, when I wrote to the then information minister of the ANC, Thabo Mbeki, in exile in Zambia, and persuaded him that LGBT plus rights were consistent with the ANC's Freedom Charter. That was a really big moment for South African LGBT plus people, because it led subsequently to the post-apartheid constitution being the first in the world to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. So it would have been great to have Thabo Mbeki in the film, but there were so many other people as well. There, Mike Tyson. It would have been great to interview him about the ambush I did outside his gym in Memphis in 2002, or Angela Davis about the World Youth Festival in 1973 in communist East Berlin, where I staged the first protest in a communist country. Angela was head of the US delegation to that festival, and the US delegation demanded my expulsion from the festival because I was promoting gay liberation, which they said was not consistent with the aims and ideals of a liberation festival. That's how homophobic things were back in those days. Now, of course, Angela's, I don't know whether she personally agreed with or authorized that letter demanding my expulsion, but whatever, she's since become not only a great supporter of the LGBT plus movement, but she herself has come out as a lesbian. So redemption and history turns a circle.
And I mean, as much as there's obviously been cut and not included in the film, you do get this amazing sense of the array of things and these little hints at those moments, even if we can't go into depth with them. But one thing that I thought was really fascinating was the inclusion of the Archbishop George Carey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury during the outings scandal period. Chris, can you tell us about involving him in the documentary and the decision to do that?
Yeah, so I had an interview list with probably 200 different names on it, and he was right up the top there. I didn't expect him to cooperate or be involved, to be honest, but you always got to try, and you've got to approach and make efforts to get these conversations. I thought it was particularly important because I saw the film as having a bit of a subtext in terms of religion going on, and where Peter and his mum fit inside that debate over religion. And I also saw Peter sort of, for me, I had a little bit of a guide with the story of Jesus Christ and how Jesus used to help the poor, and he had these stories and these ideas that were confrontational at the time. And I kind of, there's a little bit of that going on with the film. So I wanted to have a religious person in the film, and obviously I went to the former Archbishop George Carey because of what happened with the Easter sermon, and I knew I had the archive footage from that sermon, and I had access to a photographer who took lots of stills at that. And so I sort of hit on this idea of maybe recreating it using the archive. So when you watch the film, you kind of feel like you're part of it. So I've turned archive into an observational documentary at that point, because we're sort of getting more and closer towards the contemporary part of the story. But yes, I was amazed when he said agreed to do this. And I think he did it. I don't want to put words in it like ideas and say what his motivation was, but I do feel like he must have probably realised that his opinion on gay rights and equality at that time was wrong. And this has given him an opportunity to be vindicated in a way. And, you know, I think he was happy to do that. When we did the interview, it was there was a lot more material I couldn't include in the film, but he did indicate to me that he has friendships with same-sex relationship people that are raising families in his own little community. So I think, you know, in the 80s, he was against that happening. And, you know, I'm actually a son with two lesbian mothers that grew up in the 70s and 80s. So what he was actually saying was really bad, because it was putting public opinion against family units like I was growing up in. So I was really happy to sort of call him out on that. And he was very generous with his explanations and things. I think now that he isn't so heavily involved in that position, I think it's giving him an opportunity to be able to take a different line to what he might have to take if he was still the Archbishop. Yeah, but I was thrilled to have him in the film. And I think, you know, with films, you really want to have someone go through a journey where they end up almost 180-degree opinion to where they were before. And he certainly provides that. And I think for a straight audience that watch this film, he's kind of their voice, I guess. And so he represents that opinion in the film as well. So it was really important from that perspective. Yeah.
And Peter, what was it like seeing that footage when he kind of says at the end that he thinks you've done a great job?
Well, it was, first of all, very surprising, and secondly, very generous, you know, exceedingly so. He didn't have to say any of that. But obviously, as Chris has said, over the intervening years, and perhaps partly because I challenged him, or myself and my colleagues from Outrage challenged him on Easter Sunday, 1998, in his own cathedral, and called him out over his support for anti-gay laws, he has been on a journey. And that is what I always wanted, you know. For me, protest is not the be-all and end-all. It's not the end game. Protest is a means to raise public awareness about issues by getting news coverage, by putting people in power on the spot, and hopefully encouraging them to rethink their stance and their policies. And that certainly is what happened with George Carey. And, you know, my goal always is to turn enemies into friends, to turn homophobes and other support injustice into allies who will stand with us. You know, I don't take this view that once someone's made a mistake, they are damned forever. I don't agree with a version of cancel culture where people make a mistake or do something bad and they can never be redeemed. I'm always looking for redemption and forgiveness. You know, that's the way forward. Hold out the olive branch, challenge people, you know, call out bigots and those who perpetrate injustice, but always hold out the hope and the option, the possibility that they might change.
There's this really fascinating part of the film where, you know, you try to get elected to Parliament and it's unsuccessful because of a huge homophobic campaign against you. And I mean, I'm just wondering, in terms of the things you were just saying, like was that when you think back on that, or when you look at that footage now, do you think it's so important that you lost in some way, or that you didn't go into electoral politics and that you ended up staying with this kind of activist politics instead. How do you think about that now?
Well, of course, I did stand for Parliament as a left-wing Labour candidate supporting LGBT plus rights because I wanted to be in Parliament to help change things from the inside. But I never would have been a traditional member of Parliament. I would have still continued doing protests and extra parliamentary action from the outside as well, working with and empowering social movements outside of Parliament. Having said that, probably the fact that I was not elected was for the good, because it gave me the freedom and the flexibility to do things that it would have been quite difficult to do as an elected member of Parliament. So I had much greater leeway, and my activism from the outside was very instrumental. Not me alone, of course, me and many others, but my activism was instrumental in helping to change public consciousness, not just about LGBT plus issues, but about many other human rights and civil liberties issues as well. And that put Parliament under pressure. When public opinion began to change, then politicians became more confident about changing the law.
When you started doing LGBTQ plus activism, and you imagined the future and what needed to change, where we're at now, is this what you had imagined? Are we beyond what you could have ever imagined?
Well, of course, when I first came out and began LGBT plus campaigning in 1969, age 17 in Melbourne, in the state of Victoria, homosexuality was still a serious criminal offence. You could be jailed for several years. There was widespread police harassment, even violence against the community. But there were no LGBT plus organisations in Melbourne, no counselling services, no helplines, no switchboards, absolutely nothing. I can remember at the age of 17 trying to persuade the few other gay people I knew to set up an organisation, but they were all horrified. They said, "Go away! You'll get us all arrested." They were terrified, and perhaps with good reason. So all I could do back in those days was write letters to newspapers calling out homophobic reporting, or making the case for an end to police harassment and the decriminalisation of homosexuality. Modelled on the experience of the Black civil rights movement in America, that it would probably take LGBT plus people about 50 years to win formal legal equality in Western countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. And that was just a speculative guesstimate, but it's almost turned out to be right. And that's what sort of kept me going. I knew it was going to be a long, hard slog. I knew there weren't going to be quick fixes, easy reforms. But I was in it for the long haul. I was determined that I wanted to do my bit with many others to make those changes possible.
One thing I was really fascinated about was this group Outrage that you were central to forming, that we see in the film. And I wondered, you didn't have time to cover this, Chris, in the film, I suppose, but Peter, what was the relationship between Outrage and the other groups that were operating at the time, like ACT UP, doing kind of AIDS activism? Was there a lot of tension between groups? Did they work together? What was it like being an activist in Outrage in that milieu of activism?
Well, Outrage was in many ways a reincarnation of the London Gay Liberation Front, which I was involved in the early 1970s. It was a very radical group. It had a radical vision about social change, not mere equality, but challenging the status quo, changing society as it was, seeking a new kind of democracy, a sexual democracy. And we worked with other human rights groups and social movements. We very much saw ourselves as part of a wider spectrum for social change. But most of the other LGBT plus groups were very dedicated to parliamentary lobbying. And of course, that has its place. But it wasn't adequate because back then, Parliament refused to even discuss LGBT plus rights, let alone change the law. So our direct action activism in Outrage, which is very much modeled on the suffragette campaign for votes for women, and also the Black Civil Rights Movement in America in the 1960s, our direct action, nonviolent and civil disobedient, was designed to put LGBT plus news and issue headlines. If the media wouldn't report us, if Parliament wouldn't debate our issues, we were going to do startling, shocking, confrontational direct actions that would get lots of media coverage. And through that media coverage, our strategy was to raise public awareness, to conscientize the public about the scale of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic discrimination. And off the back of those news reports, there followed lots of TV debates, radio phone-in programs. We would go on those and debate and show why anti-LGBT plus discrimination was wrong and how change could happen. So we created a momentum for social change, a momentum to change public hearts and minds, which I think was very successful. And then, of course, ultimately, a momentum for people in power to rethink the kinds of anti-LGBT plus policies they were pursuing and feel under sufficient pressure that they were moving forward to bring us reform.
Mm.
And Chris, you yourself are also an activist for LGBTQ rights, as evidenced by the fact that you're making documentaries like this. But I mean, how did you feel changed by watching this and this footage and things like Outrage's actions, which were so much about imagining a different world rather than just kind of, tinkering within the existing structures? I mean, has it changed how you think about activism as well?
Yeah, I think activism, like what we're talking about with the suffragettes and also the Black Lives Matter and Black Civil Rights Movement, has been there in the zeitgeist for quite a while. But I think what was particularly brave for the gay liberation movement in the UK at that point was the stigma was really intense. There was a lot of homophobia, and also with the AIDS epidemic as well, that just kind of added extra fuel to the homophobes to sort of criticize the community as though that was God had brought this horrible disease to the planet and stuff. So they were doing that at a time when, it was very, very brave to go out and be visible and public. And at the same time, the UK, I was in Australia at the time, reading Face magazine and things like that, and you're getting like this amazing sort of gender disparity in like music videos, and Boy George and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and things like that were going on musically and in the entertainment sphere. So I was always like watching it from the UK, just like, God, I want to be in London, part of that, because it felt like what was happening in London and the UK was just so brave, and like a revolution was happening. And so I wanted to be a part of that. And I think that was one of my motivations for moving to London in 2000, was to sort of be part of this political landscape where it was bubbling and things were happening. And, as a consequence, we now have obviously gay marriage. I'm in a civil partnership myself. And there's been all these amazing like changes in the law and equality. And I think it has proliferated outside of the UK. It's in Europe and America now and Australia. But, there's still so much more that needs to happen in Middle Eastern countries, in Africa and Asia, throughout South America. So, it's still spreading. It's still the liberation and the revolution is still happening. I think now what we're finding with direct action is people can find the information, be educated. It's our straight allies are getting involved as well. So it does feel like it's going to be very hard to sort of close Pandora's box as much as I know a lot of right-wing governments would like to do. I think the cat's out of the bag now. So, yeah, and Peter and what they were doing in the UK in the 70s and 80s, that was very much the impetus for all of this. So, I just am so glad that I'm able to contribute with this film and create something for a new generation to watch and learn from and hopefully be inspired by, like I am.
Peter, what do you think now are the most urgent issues around LGBTQ plus rights? Some of them are touched on at the end of the documentary, but encouraging people that are watching this to think about what's going on. What should we be thinking about?
Well, it's outrageous that in Britain today and many other countries, it's still legal to pursue and practice LGBT plus conversion therapy. That is, practices which aim to change someone's gender identity or sexual orientation on the basis that it's sinful, abnormal, or unnatural. This has been condemned by the world's major psychological, medical, and counseling services, yet clearly it is still going on, and our government here in Britain has for 3 years promised to ban it, but still hasn't done so, even though there's masses of evidence to show that it's not only unethical, but it's also harmful and it doesn't work. Another big issue here we have in Britain is the bid to reform the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for trans people to change their legal documents. At the moment, it's a very complicated, bureaucratic, lengthy procedure. And there are countries like Ireland and Malta that have reformed the law. I don't see any reason why Britain can't. But of course, the bigger picture is the global scale, where there are still 70 countries and jurisdictions that criminalize same-sex relations. 11 have the death penalty. 37 criminalize either explicitly or by default trans people. So these global issues, we've got still so far to go.
And I think in COVID times, we're really seeing an intersection of a lot of LGBTQ issues with what's going on in different places with the pandemic. I know in Australia, it's very difficult for refugees to come here at the moment because of our kind of border rules, and that, already it was a very difficult issue for LGBTQ asylum seekers, and now we're seeing how the pandemic is affecting people in different ways. Is that something that the Peter Tatchell Foundation is thinking about, is pandemic-related problems?
Well, we've been doing work supporting LGBT plus asylum seekers for many, many years, helping them prepare their asylum applications, getting them out of detention when they're being detained without good reason, finding them better accommodation than is provided by the Home Office here in the UK. So that work continues, and you're right, with COVID, the opportunities for LGBT plus people to get to Britain to claim asylum have been dramatically reduced because of the closure of borders, either exit or entry, and the limited amount of airline seats that are available from many destinations. So we are working with quite a lot of people still stuck in countries where they're under threat of persecution, including arrest, imprisonment, and possible torture, as well as mob violence. We're working with them to help sustain them in their home countries until the opportunities for asylum can be eased. But ultimately, of course, we want to change those home countries so that people don't feel the need to flee the country of their birth, give up their families, their friends, their jobs to come to places like Britain or Australia. And that, of course, is a much bigger task because, we can't change those cultures or those laws or institutions. It has to come from within. But we're certainly working with both LGBT plus and other human rights organizations, mainstream human rights organizations in many countries to support their efforts to change the law and to ease persecution.
I mean, thinking about the pandemic as well in terms of how it's been affecting activism, Peter, how should we be thinking about direct action in these times? I mean, has it changed what you've been doing?
Well, of course, the amount of LGBT plus protest and direct action has dramatically reduced during the pandemic. But I'm very proud to say that on Saturday, the 24th of July in London, we held Britain's first ever Reclaim Pride protest. It was a march to reclaim pride for the community and to put LGBT plus human rights front and center. Now, that is completely different from the way in which Pride in London and most other big city prides have gone in recent years. They are incredibly corporate and commercial. They hardly ever mention LGBT plus human rights. This depoliticization, this removal of pride from the community is not what pride is about or should be about. So we reclaimed it. Thousands of us came out. I think we sent a message that there are a lot of people in our community who are not happy with the way in which the prides like Pride in London have lost touch with the community and with our human rights concerns.
It's so inspiring to hear about. And I mean, Chris, can you tell us what's happening in your world as well at this time? Can you tell us what you're working on?
Yeah, I'm looking. Well, I wanted to follow up this film with something that was happening here in Australia, in Queensland in particular, because I wasn't sure I'd be able to travel, and that turned out to be the case. So in terms of what's happening here, there's a mine that's being greenlit up in Galilee Basin in North Queensland. There's a billionaire, Adani, who has a mining lease, and it's taken 10 years, but he's finally got some coal out of the ground, and he basically wants to put that on a train and then put that onto boats that goes through the Great Barrier Reef to India. So, it's ridiculous. They're building a thermal coal mine at a time when all the experts and even governments like the American government and the British government are basically saying no to coal and closing down mines. Here in Australia, they're looking at opening up like a coal reserve that could go on for 50 years. And it's very frustrating to see this happen in a country that I was born in a country that suffered all those bushfires that started last year, where the science says we can't, keep adding to the temperature of this planet. It's causing bleaching in the reef. It's rising tides. So, I'm using my skills that I've learned making this film about Peter and diving into archives, and I'm going to put that to good use now to help the Stop Adani movement and the traditional owners of the land where they're building this mine, so that hopefully I can do a similar thing to this, where I basically encapsulate everything into a 90-minute film that is gripping and entertaining and thrilling, but also very educational and informative. And I hope that may help close the mine down potentially, or be a contributing factor in raising awareness. But yeah, it's terrible what's going on there, and there needs to be further investigation into if there's corruption that's allowing this to happen in the government. There needs to be some sort of accountability. So yeah, another direct action film from me. Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll absolutely keep an eye out for it. We're just about out of time, so I'm wondering if there's anything else that either of you would like to add before we finish. Chris?
Oh, look, I'm just very grateful to the Melbourne International Film Festival. I'd like to thank them for believing in this film and being a contributing partner in getting this made. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm really excited that audiences are going to get to finally watch the film here in Australia, and fingers crossed I'll be able to see that on a big screen myself, which I haven't been able to do yet. I just hope people watch the film and they're inspired by Peter's story, and instead of just like signing petitions and giving money to charity, I hope that people that watch the film decide they want to go a little step further and actually get involved in direct action, go that step further to fight for any injustice in their communities, so that, you know, that people power can create change. And, you know, I really hope that younger generations and audiences that watch this film get more involved in whatever they care about.
Absolutely. And Peter, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share with us?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate Chris's points of appreciation to the Melbourne International Film Festival for, you know, believing in this project and for hosting the premiere. And you've all been fantastic, so thank you so much. For me, the main point of making this film has been to show that social change is possible, and through my work, exposing some ideas on how to do that. You know, what I want to do is inspire future generations to take up the mantle of progressive social change, of using protest as an instrument for a better world. And, you know, my way isn't the only way, but it's one way. And I think through this film, you can see some of the ways in which I've helped move the dial in the right direction. So for the future, I think we all know that protest is the lifeblood of democracy, that protest is the way social change happens. Politicians are often the last to get the message about the need for reform. It's social movements outside of Parliament that are the originators of social change, whether it be the suffragettes or the Black Civil Rights Movement, or in Australia, the movement against the Vietnam War and conscription in the 1960s. These were external parliamentary movements that eventually forced politicians to change. And I think they show that we, the people, have the power, that we, the people, can be change makers. So thank you so much.
I have absolutely no doubt that this film and people seeing your activism, Peter, will make a difference. It made a difference to me as someone who is already involved in activism and just wanting to do so much more. So it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you both today, and I'd like to thank you so much for your time. And also point audiences that are watching this to view the full program of films, to obviously watch Hating Peter Tatchell if you haven't already. Sorry, there's probably been a lot of spoilers in this chat. But also the other films, talks and special events, and you can find out about all of these at miff.com.au. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really nice chatting.
Thank you. Thank you.